Hello, everyone. I hope you're enjoying the summit so far and all the other sessions. And thank you, Andrew and team, for the kind invitation. Pretty excited to be here and to speak about the data mesh today. As probably most of you know, it's been quite a hype concept for the past, well, what is it, like 2.5 years or so now? However, I was kind of missing practical applications and tutorials, essentially how to apply it in your organization or my organization for that case. So that's why I want to talk today a bit about how to use the data mesh to solve practical problems in your org and thus ultimately unlock a new growth potential. Before we dive into that, just a little bit about me. My name is Nick. My background is a little bit all over the place. I once studied music and also economics before I then dropped out of college to start my own business, StageLink, where there I led the product development side of things, while my co-founder was taking care of marketing and sales. We built multiple products over the years, pivoted a couple times, raised a bunch of money until we found product market fit with essentially an automated advertising software. For the ones of you here who are building tech in the space or somewhat familiar with it, at the core of the product that we built was a reinforcement learning algorithm, essentially a multi-armed bandit that we tweaked a little bit for our use cases. And with that, we were able to optimally allocate ad budgets across various creatives, target groups, and also channels to maximize return on ad spend or return on invest. After what was an incredible, exciting 7 years, we sold the business to a marketing agency in Fleury from Berlin, who had already been a major client for us and in the end wanted to have exclusive rights for our technology. So that was a great fit. After a brief stint in 2020 that I spent there and supported the team as kind of an interim CPO to integrate our product into their suite of various products and services, I figured that agency life wasn't so much for me and dropped out of there, kind of defaulted to solo consulting and started to advise startups, but also scale-ups with all things product and data management, as that was what I had learned over the years before, essentially building data products in organizations. Maybe I didn't call it that when we started out at StageLink. However, ultimately figured that was really what I was doing and really excited and passionate about. In the past 18 months, I did that almost exclusively for a music marketing platform and publisher network called Linkfire, post their IPO in 2021. I mainly helped them to build the product and data organization and the team structure. And that was also where we used data-driven design, domain-driven design as a core concept. And it was at Linkfire where I encountered a real-world use case that allowed us to use the data mesh, to define it, to figure out why would we need it, how can it help us, to help with a couple of issues that we encountered. And that is something that I would like to show to you today. Just last week, I actually started a new role as a director of product for HelloFresh's global AI tribe. However, I just started, so I can't talk much about that journey yet. Maybe something for next year. All right. Before I tell you how we implemented the data mesh, I want to show you one slide, why you should even listen to that, why that might matter for you. All right. So in good product manner, let's put the outcomes first. What were the results that we were hoping for? In this case, since we are looking at it from after the fact, the outcomes that we actually achieved by implementing the data mesh at Linkfire. There are multiple, and this is like 7 that I wanted to list here to hopefully inspire you, give you an idea of why it could be worthwhile to think about that concept. The first thing that we were able to achieve was a drastically reduced time to insight, which leads to faster decision making. Why was that? We made the data more discoverable, faster discoverable, more accessible for any kind of stakeholder or person who would use that data, so that they would readily have the information available to make data-driven decisions. We also were able to increase reliability on the technical and factual side And also on the perceived side, which might be even more important, since that builds trust with all the stakeholders to use data more for decision making. And that, of course, ultimately leads to also making better decisions. Introducing the data mesh also helped us to run many more experiments across the board. Experiments, A/B tests, other type of experiments, which of course also generate insight from data that allow us to make better decisions. We were also able to reduce the time that data analysts spent wrangling the data, preparing the data, finding the data, preparing reports and analyses for their stakeholders. We reduced data downtime, the downtime defined as any time where data was not in its expected state, meaning data could be missing, could be wrong, could be in the wrong place. And that's obviously something that you want to avoid, like you want to avoid application downtime. However, sometimes this happens, and then what's important is to resolve the incidents as fast as possible. And we were also able to increase the resolution, decrease the resolution time, increase the resolution speed after implementing the data mesh at Linkfire. And last but not least, having data readily available to make decisions also inspires new ideas. Being able to make analyses and discover insights from data quickly allows you to come up with new ideas to potentially improve, enhance your products, or come up with completely new innovative solutions. All right, I'm guessing that sounds great. You probably want some or all of that. So how did we get there? What you will see in the next, I think, 10 or so slides is basically what we at Linkfire, with a small cross-functional task force that involved decision makers from commercial, tech, and product and data, we pitched that to the Linkfire management team to, in the end, get the green light to proceed with what was a bit more holistic data strategy that was built around the concept and the idea of the data mesh and had that as a core. And we made this pitch threefold. First, to identify the need. Why do we even need it? And that's what we a bit talked about, but we didn't know about all those outcomes. They were essentially estimates or predictions or maybe even hopes at sometimes. Then we laid out what that meant for us to achieve that, what changes we need to make. And then also, of course, a rollout plan, since that is something that you cannot expect this to happen over days or weeks. This is a process that will at least take many months to fully roll out in your organization. All right, what is the problem? Well, also here, like power of three, we use that as well. So 3 steps: problem, plan, rollout. And the problem, again, we divided in 3 different categories. First one, as our businesses grew enormously, also the volume and the complexity of the data and the demands for data exploded, which led to a number of challenges. We had some legacy technical architectures which did not really meet the requirements anymore and started or were at risk of failing. Then requests to our analysts, or business intelligence specialists, reached new highs, and they essentially became a bottleneck to making decisions, which stalled some decisions, delayed others, which is obviously not great for the business. And then thirdly, the load times for just acquiring, collecting some of the data really exploded. For example, in our BI tools, which led to frustrated users and potentially even service level agreement violations. The second point that we made is, besides risk of failure, we were able to observe a lot of inefficiencies, which are costly for the business. A large percentage of the data analyst's time was spent on just finding and processing data for various stakeholders. And similarly, data engineers had to make sure to keep data downtime in check and attend to a growing number of incidents because of the infrastructure that was quite stressed. And here we already hinted at some ways to counter that by having clear ownership in a decentralized fashion. And on the other hand, also have a more global governance, operation, and infrastructure layer, which is something that we'll get to when talking about the solutions or what the data mesh allows us to do. However, back to the problem space of things, we were talking about risk of failure, inefficiencies, and thirdly, last, but definitely not least, all of these kind of distract us to actually use data to its full potential and use data to power new innovation and growth for the business. Leverage it to drive outcomes by, for example, running frequent experiments to iteratively improve products and also processes, or by leveraging data to build machine learning models that will help us to improve our solutions, our products, and with that, our business further. Okay, that was the problem state of things. Now we thought about how can we meet those new demands, the growing pains that we were experiencing. And of course, also from just thinking about it, we see similarities to what the engineering world had seen years ago with an agile movement, where a lot of companies shifted away from large monolithic architectures that became bottlenecks to more domain-oriented microservices, which in turn led to greater development speed and ultimately faster value creation for the customer and user. So we created a data strategy around the same idea of domain-driven design. And then, of course, being interested in what was happening generally in the world, we stumbled upon or found Zhamak Dehghani's article that she published in her role at ThoughtWorks at the time, I believe at the end of 2019, where she saw very similar problems and challenges with a lot of her mostly enterprise clients that she was working with. And she proposed the data mesh, which she calls a socio-technical approach to organizing and leveraging data in an organization. She's mostly talking about analytical processes, and that is definitely also something to be aware of. How does that then work in balance with the transactional, the operational loads that you have? But she decides to focus on that piece because she sees this has been overlooked too much in the past and is leading to a lot of the constraints and issues that we just talked about. And the data mesh has 4 main principles, where I think the first one, I guess she lists as the second, but for me, that is the most important, and it's kind of an overarching principle or philosophy, how to think about data as a product. What does it mean to think about data as a product? It means to identify, like start with the customer and the user, identify the customer's needs, and then ultimately discover and deliver a solution with the data, around the data, that generates value to the user, is usable, and meets the constraints being feasible and viable for the business. So really applying that product thinking to the data world. The second principle, decentralized domain ownership, talked about a little bit already, like breaking up monolith, breaking up central teams that might become bottlenecks, and making sure that teams are autonomously able to own a piece of the data that the company has, and that they are able to produce data in a way that serves their consumers and their users, which then is really kind of married with the data as a product idea. Global standards by federated governance is also an important piece of what Zhamak talks or writes about. So like we can't have anarchy, of course. So we want decentralized ownership. However, we need also to meet some standards to ensure that the data is interoperable. That's the, I think, main concept here, so that the different domains can speak to each other, can communicate, usually via some kind of API layer. That is also where the shared infrastructure, the platform, comes into play, similarly to the DevOps world, where we usually have also there probably even a central team that organizes, builds, and serves an infrastructure that all the individual services can tap into, so they don't have to reinvent the wheel for everything they built, which of course is the more efficient way to go with it. Okay, so we had the theory, we had some ideas, we knew why we wanted to do it. So how did we get started? The first thing that we actually did is to just list all the data assets that we had in the organization and build a relational graph. So of course, like the user, which belongs to an organization, a subscription, the user can create certain assets. So this is of course a bit abstracted here from the actual concrete use case that we had. We listed the assets, wrote down the relationships, and then clustered them into domains which we felt had a good boundary. So that the main, I think, thought that you should have here is, how do you define boundaries? So you could come up with some technical clustering potentially. However, it's really hard to embed these data assets in a way that you could actually solve this with, well, you could even actually use a machine learning clustering algorithm to do that. We did this a bit differently. Also, like maybe we had 50 or so data assets in the end that we came up with. So we were still able to do this all on a whiteboard, albeit a digital one. And then doing that, like we noticed that was actually fairly straightforward for us. And luckily also resembling a lot the organizational structure or the team structure that we already had. So apparently implicitly we had done some of these things right. Talking about the team structure, we then thought about, okay, all of those domains, clustering them we clustered them, what we then ended up calling value streams. And value streams because we thought about like, what is the particular mission for the data, the product, the whole business unit towards creating value for one or more of our customer groups, which could be internal or external. And then we came with this concept of a value stream, which was truly cross-functional. So it was comprised of product, customer success, and customer acquisition functions like marketing, sales, to really own the individual value creation behind this set or cluster. That was not so streamlined or clear in the beginning, but it was important for us to work on that and to see how could the data mesh as a concept also inform organizational design, which is something that Zhamak Dehghani also talked about, which is obviously really important. You can also think about Conway's law, stating that the organizational design does constrain the development or anything that you can build with that organization. I think that's very much true. That's why we spent a lot of time thinking about this. Like, how could we organize this in value stream? How can we make it cross-functional? Which functions do not fit in the value stream? So some operational layer, which could then take care of the infrastructure, for example, but also some administrative layers, finance and HR, would not really fit in there. So we didn't want to force anything onto the structure that doesn't make sense, but use the new ideas that we had to rather refine our existing organization. And in the end, that's what was what we pitched to the management. Said, all right, like, what is it? If you saw all those problems, you experience them every day as well. So changing that requires a shift in mindset, requires a change in the organization. Both are essentially for free. Of course, that is not entirely true organizational change, especially like, when we train a lot of people. They will need to actually learn new jobs, learn new relationships. So like there are some, I guess, startup costs with that. And also some infrastructure and tooling that we proposed specifically to buy or license was something that costs something. However, the inefficiencies saved were much larger and especially the opportunities we'll be able to create with data by, if you remember, like being able to use this to innovate, create new ideas, implement machine learning and AI into what we do. That was something that was only possible with this shift. And then we got the green light. And of course, need a rollout plan, which we basically put in 4 different steps. Most importantly, since we had so far worked in a small task force with some engineering leaders, commercial, product and data, presented it to the management. However, now we need to get the whole organization on board. And for that, we needed to articulate and communicate repeatedly over and over the organizational framework. What does it mean? Why do we need it? So that is something that really came first. Also pick some champions and advocates or ambassadors to roll this out across the organization that we had already, of course, spoken to a little bit before. Then from that task force, we created something that we called the Data Governance Committee, because we didn't want a fixed team that was in charge of creating global standards and making sure that they can be enforced throughout the organization. We wanted to have a flexible group with some maybe steady members, but also some ones that would rotate over time. And that group, for example, would make sure that we had global metrics definitions, that we had global standards how to use our data warehouse. And that is something that that group would come up with, define, of course, talking to their users and customers of that whole operations, of that whole organizational structure, which were a lot of the people within the company, their colleagues. And then communicating that and also creating a way of ensuring that people would adhere to those standards. Thirdly, we then established data ownership in those value streams that we discussed. So really made sure sometimes it was architectural things that we actually needed to move ownership of certain data assets. In a lot of cases, it was just a mindset that the people in those teams, and on the side before you saw we had data analysts and data engineers in every of those value streams. So that is another thing that we did. We broke up a central data engineering team, which would build and maintain all the data pipelines that we had, and embedded data analysts and engineers in each of those value streams. So they were really fully equipped to own and maintain the data that they would produce and make sure that it would actually meet the needs of the data consumers. Again, coming from this data as a product thinking, always think about the needs of the consumer, the data user first, in order to then inform the decision how you should architect, construct your product, which would serve that data. And then the fourth thing that we did is thinking about those infrastructural or shared service layer, where we thought about which processes and tools do we need to not only ensure the global standards actually, but also make sure there's a productive way of using all of those. So there's some things that we did there was, I'll give you some examples. One tool that we built was a data monitoring observability platform for the teams. So every team had this problem that they wanted to figure out, is their data in an expected state, right? Like we had this issue before of data downtime and incident resolution, which the data monitoring tool actually helped us a lot to improve those metrics that we were tracking as success measures for how also this implementation and rollout of the data mesh within the company was going. So that was something where we built a central tool to monitor data. So essentially it was running queries on architecture on, first what we did was a data lake, and then later the idea was to expand that to the data warehouse. The individual teams would be able to register their data assets on there and certain observability metrics that they would want to measure. And then everything else was taken care by the platform tool for them. Similarly, we did that with a dashboarding infrastructure where teams often wanted to have similar metrics, dashboards to monitor their progress, but also the health of the applications, for example, like the management or like finance functions wanted to have a broader overview. So we needed some standards for the individual value stream so that we could then also aggregate all of that automatically into a more holistic view of the state of the company, for example. And maybe the third thing I can mention is the experimentation platform, where we actually started more with processes and a technical platform, how to run experimentations. That also already helped the teams to run many more of them and make data-driven decisions based on the outcomes and results of those experiments. All right, so we went through the 3 steps. Like we identified issues, problems that we wanted to tackle, came up with a theoretical concept using the data management and a more holistic strategy, how to counter them, and figure out what exactly do we need to do, what are the different steps from clustering the relational data assets that we had to come up with an organizational structure that fit this, and then rolling it out ultimately. I hope that was somewhat informative for you guys and is something that you can potentially use in your own organization. Of course, probably not all of it. There will be some ideas, bits and pieces here and there. If you have any more questions, feedback, just want to chat, I think the easiest is to find me on Twitter or LinkedIn. And yeah, I'm looking forward. And yeah, have fun with the rest of the summit and all the other sessions. Thanks for watching. Cheers.